guess we're going to be talking about how nationalism is not only as un-American as possibly can be, but we'll show how it has actually been uh, really against the actual ideas of the founders, and some of their ideas that they've pushed are actually completely against what would actually be from what the ideas of even some of what our country has even pushed from its even inception when it comes down to what they want on foreign policy and what they've pushed for a lot of these different things. And we'll see that it's merely just a rehashing of policies of the racist policies of the progressive era that have been some of our darkest times as a country, and have actually essentially ruined what we've actually been as a country. Now, if you start looking at it, let's start going actually at our electoral map, because most of the nationalism they tend to push, which is the idea of immigration restriction and why we need a southern border. Now, if you start this is where we started as a country, which is the 1789 election. You go on to the 1792 election. Uh, that's the second election, still about the same size. We still have not gotten into the southern border, 1796. Still around the same area. Here's we go into the 1800 election, 1804, 1808, still roughly in the same area. We're in 1812, and that's where we start to get Louisiana, so it's going out there a little bit more. 1820. Now we're starting to fill in many more spots. We're starting to fill in kind of the open area with it. We go all the way to Maine with it. The only thing we're lacking is Arkansas by 1820. Uh, Still the same basic map when we get to 1824, 1828. Same basic map, 1832. We've got this same map. Now we grab Arkansas right here, and Michigan during this period, 1840. No change there. 1844, no change. And now right here is 1848, which tends to be a very, very critical year where we want to look at. Now, the reason why is because this is the first one that adds an actual border state with Mexico. We're less concerned about, we're not really going to make a concern about Canada because people beyond making joking statements have not made any serious statements about Canada, so we're not even going to make that into an issue. But Texas is the first one right here. This is 1848. Zachary Taylor won the election, and the Democrats won that year. Won Texas. Now, what we need to understand is that this is the first one in that year, and we had there was no intention of an actual border. Now, if that was the first year of ownership, and that would be the first inkling that we wanted over Mexico, wouldn't that be what I call the most likely time to establish a border, specifically just over there, and just to establish some type of security? Well, the fact is there never was an actual border back then. The only times where there's actually been a border is in modern era. And this has actually been pretty recent that there's actually been a border. There's never been an actual historic border on there. When you keep going down, you'll actually see going down here with California. California again has never really had a border since except in modern times. With the era, uh, we go to 1860, 1864, 1868. We're starting to fill up to 1872. Still no extra border towns. Up to 1876, 1880, 1884, 1888, 92, 1896. 1900 would be the next one. 1904, 1908. So 1912, which would be the first election with it. This would be the first one, and this was under progressive Democrat Woodrow Wilson. And even though he did have highly racist policies, we still, even at this time, we still did not have a border wall. He had highly racist policies against blacks, and that was the whole point. And even going into the 1916, still did not do that. Warren G. Harding was another one. We still did not have a border wall. We were talking. You keep going through, and you're going to find out that there was no border wall. 1928. That's Herbert Hoover. Roosevelt, 1932, 1936, 1940, and 1944. 48 would have been Truman. Still nothing. 52. It was basically not until I believe it was in the 80s that we did not even consider, like 70s or 80s, that we did not even consider a border wall with Mexico. And the only reason why was because we had already established a welfare state. And that would have been establishing through Lyndon Baines Johnson, who had changed around immigration law to be loosened against specifically East Asians. There was basically biased against East Asians from the late 1800s. So he had basically loosened up our immigration policy. And I'll go over immigration policy and why it is actually not even constitutional, even as is written. But basically, when he started to bring in that welfare state, that was their only justification of establishing a border wall, and I'll explain why that is not a legitimate verification for establishing a border wall over Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. They used that, and the other justification was that there was we'll show over the next administration, which was the war on drugs, and the war on drugs was basically established through an act of United Nations that was starting in the late 60s, and that was the United Nations who would basically, that was one of their agendas to actually pass it through. And basically is what that did was is that started to accelerate our war on drugs, and that was very, very expensive. Then we've only continued to add on with that, and we've used that as well with the border wall, as if the war on drugs has actually succeeded. And it only got worse under each president. And they've actually acted like the thing's been a success when the thing's only been a financial boondoggle. I misspoke there, but and it's only been a money pit when it comes down to it, and we've used it, and they've even recently tried to say that you could get terrorists through the southern border when when the whole thing has basically been through more intervention. Now, we can actually look up the point at which terrorists start, and we can see that that goes back to 1 AD. Now, we can actually see that when we start to look at what was some of our core ideas when it comes to foreign policy first. Now, we can actually look at this quote by Thomas Jefferson, who was our first Secretary of State. That's, if you're going to get anything with it, that would actually be the best way to judge it. And he stated that peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. This exactly explains our original foreign policy. This is the foreign policy that we should have as a nation, not what we adopted. Now, what we adopted during the progressive era was actually something completely different. This is what we would call a liberal foreign policy perspective. This is where we thought that we can actually remake other nations in our image, and basically where we can intervene in the affairs of other nations. This is what started us basically putting our military around the globe and us acting as this whole big wide empire. And this started through the whole progressive era with Teddy Roosevelt onto the current status, and it's wasted trillions of dollars, and it's actually put us in debt. And pretty much the debt can actually be attributed to a very if not a near 50-50 mix, it might be actually slightly advantaged on the on our military actions, including the war on drugs and war on terror and other things as that, because those things have been very, very expensive. And then when we start to look at with it, when the whole thing is basically is we need to understand is on immigration with it, on that wall with it. Now, if we start to look at it, you can actually see as we see with John Jay, who was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and co-author of the Federalist Papers, he pointed out in an 1819 letter that it will, I presume, be admitted that slaves were persons intended. The word slaves was avoided probably on account of the existence toleration of slavery and of its discordance with the principles of the Revolution, and formed with the consciousness of its being repugnant to the following positions of the Declaration of Independence, viz., we hold these truths to be self-evident: all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This basically notes that that they were basically going to assume that on the term migration, that they avoided, that what they were doing is they were using the terms migration to avoid this. Migration was merely of actually trading a slave between one point to another, and allowed for interstate trade of slaves. And because essentially they were people with it, they had to use the term migration, and because they would not fit under any other system. And this is the whole point that needs to be made. And we need to understand that, because it's what we have as our whole system. Now, what we've actually validated our immigration system is actually under the Commerce Clause. Now, the Commerce Clause is only meant to stop states, state-to-state tariffs of transference of goods. As in, as in, if you buy a good in one state with it, they cannot charge you would tax or tariff on that good. That's why if you look at the way they've handled the purchase of online goods, essentially you should be paying where that original good is, not where your home state is, because that's essentially a violation of your of the Commerce Clause. That means if you're buying a good that's like, let's say, an area that does not have sales tax, that means that or has a much lower sales tax than you normally would have. That means you would have to essentially pay the sales tax there with it instead of your own home sales tax. Now they cannot basically say, oh, what we need to do is to recover on loss on brick and mortar stores. That doesn't apply. And this is where the wrongful application of the law has actually happened. But going back to this is where our immigration law is coming from. They're stating that theoretically is that people entering the country are goods and services. They're not with it, because it does not matter it does not matter where you're from, because as we look at the Declaration of Independence, we can actually see that they do not state specifics of country of origin. Country of origin did not matter, and because it uses the term that all men with it did not refer to gender. They're saying that are created equal, that they're endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That means it does not limit your rights, but those are amongst those rights. Now, now when we see the Constitution, we'll see that as a limitation of government of what the government can do. Now, it's not a limitation of people's rights; it's a limitation of the government. And it's basically, when we start to see this is the whole thing of we see that the government does not have the ability to restrict people entering. Now, they do have the ability to set standards of what people can of what people have to do to become a citizen, but that is a complete other thing with it. But they would have to essentially, whatever, if you want to make it, call it a green card, call it whatever with it, but they theoretically, when it comes down, they would not have any as the original intention, would not have a objection to that. And there's reasons why, is because that was the original intention of the country, was not to limit. They had no intention of limiting the people entering the country, because they understood that when people enter the country, you get a plethora of people entering in, and it creates more competition, and the more competition means you get lower prices on goods, and you get a better quality made good. They understood that protectionism only makes goods that are more expensive and poor in quality, and all it does is lead to more inflation on goods, and that makes the quality of life go down. As we've seen, since the progressive era, we've seen far more protectionism happen in our country, and the quality of life has actually gone down since this point, in which people have noticed through the financial industry, and using the government to actually enforce more of this is only going to make things worse. And what we need to do is essentially get government out of the way, have more freedom and less protectionism. And what you're going to get, what nationalism really is nationalism is essentially hyper protectionism. and it's just an authoritarian form of government, as I'll show you in a minute, right here when we start to look at the quiz on advocates.org, which is basically they show you a basic, pretty simple quiz with it, and it really goes over some basic things and some basic questions, and we'll go over each one and showing that basically that when it comes down to it, is that nationalists do believe, no matter what country we're talking about across the globe, they do believe in the idea of authoritarian government. Now, first one is government should not censor free speech, press, the media, or the internet. And that is something that they definitely disagree with. And the reason why is because they believe that the government should intervene on the internet, and that the press and the media should basically be censored for stating things against the president. This is the whole idea of nationalism. That's the whole core point with it. While they don't think the individual's speech should be censored, they think the press, the media, and should be censored, and that the internet should be heavily regulated when it comes down to things, but they believe that there should be intervention in there. Military service should be voluntary. There should be no draft. When it comes down to that, we've seen that basically because there's more ideas of interventionist, we see that in many cases some of them disagree. But we'll go on a maybe on that one with it, because a lot of them tend to sit on the fence on that. There should be no laws regarding sex between consenting adults. That one, flat out, all of them disagree with it. This is basically across the board that we're talking. This is something that they disagree with. Repeal laws prohibiting adult possession and use of drugs. This is one they disagree with. We're talking that this is the whole thing of the the so-called opioid crisis, that they're trying to make a whole big deal on with it, that could be ended with the ending the war on drugs. They don't want it. Basically, all they want to do is they want to go after these pharmaceutical companies and sue them instead of ending the war on drugs, which has basically caused this whole thing. They don't want to do that. They want to use government force to actually basically sue these companies. This is the whole thing. They do not want to end these whole things at all with it. When they have had options, and it's each country. You look at out in the Philippines, they've wanted to go after dealers and users. You look at the same thing out in Russia. You look at the same thing out in Brazil. You look at the same thing out in Hungary and Poland. It's the same thing out there. You have the same thing out in Turkey. It's all the same idea. These ideas of these people that are that want to tell you how to live your life. Government should not target, detain, and deport undocumented workers. Well, that's part of their whole. That's part of their platform, and that's something that they all believe in. They believe in basically these people that merely just want to come to the country and work. They basically want to target them and throw them out with it, because they're basically slaves to these unions. Just like the 1920s progressives were, when you had non-union black workers in the South. Their idea was to set a minimum wage, so that black workers in the South could not come up, and there were unskilled laborers, and basically have two of them take the job of one skilled laborer by just moving up north and just looking for a better life. They did not want that to take the job of those white workers. So they they basically worked with the unions to essentially set a minimum wage so that this could not happen, and what it called to attack the black unskilled laborers. Taxpayers should not be responsible for student loan debt. A lot of them with it are on the fence when it comes down to that. They have not really made a what it called an actual statement on that. When it comes from country to country, government should not be responsible for providing health care. Usually they tend to what it called tend to disagree with that because in many areas with it, because you're talking in almost every country, they'll they'll at least to some degree with it believe in that. Let people control their own retirement, privatize Social Security. They definitely disagree with that. Replace government welfare with private charity. They definitely disagree with that. Cut taxes and government spending by 50% or more. They don't agree with that. They definitely disagree with that because they don't want to relinquish power. And in this, we're going to leave this. We're going to go past that and just calculate it, continue without saving, and you're going to see that it basically comes down as being an authoritarian. And then we're going to take the authoritarian test. We're going to start the test. Right there with it is, we're going to go with this one first, and it's authoritarians like you believe in strong central government is needed to manage the economy, build a strong nation, and protect communities from descending into chaos. Most authoritarians think that a powerful elite is required to plan and organize society. Without planning, organizing civilization is under threat. Likewise, if people are too free to amass wealth, they will take advantage of the weak. Therefore, a strong, wise elite should keep order amongst the people. In the absence of strong authority, will indulge in their vices. Someone has to become a builder, protector of a good society, and they actually believe in this. Even though a lot of nationalists state they're against what are called the quote unquote elite, with it when they're talking about here as elite, they're actually talking about government with it. And they're they're talking where government has to be this so-called leader. And they do believe in this. Okay, good to know. Let's get started. Before we begin, let's go over two fundamental powers of social change: persuasion, the power to convince others to do something or change their behavior. It starts with basic respect of others. Coercion is the power to force others by threatening them or use of violence. For individual lives, to complex geopolitics, these are two powers that you can use to create change. Now let's talk about coercion, the power to use force against someone. As an individual citizen, do believe you should have the power to use force? Check all this applies. I should have the force intruder to leave my home. That would basically, they believe in that. Power to defend my loved ones from being physically harmed. They also believe they still believe in in pretty much the idea of giving money, to taking certain things from other people and giving to others with it, depending on how much money they make. Because we're still talking, if you look at the way a lot of the nationalists do with it, they still they still believe in wealth distribution. They still do not support any conservative ideas. I should have the power to force people to leave my community or state if their lifestyle is destroying social values. If you look at the whole idea of Trump's housing ideas, you will see that actually comes from the whole idea with it. There's also Duterte's ideas on drugs, uh, and it goes from country to country where they have their own little thing where they believe what that they can use violence against it. And see, this whole thing is basically, it shows that they're 100% coercive. Now that this whole thing with it now if you look at it now, where I tend to sit with it is with this, and that this will show you with it personally for me, is that I believe that they should not censor speech. Military, they frankly with it is there should not even be a sign up with any type of draft with it. Your name shouldn't even be on there. There shouldn't be any what it calls law regarding sex with it between consenting adults. With it, they should not even be in, government should not even be involved with it. They need to get rid of the war on drugs completely, because all it's doing is actually leading to far more deaths and far more debt. Um, the government needs to basically actually respect the Constitution when it comes down to immigration. Immigrants are not the problem. The problem is debt. We can actually follow that precisely. And taxpayers should not be responsible for the student debt loan. Basically, what needs to happen is we need to actually get some reform into how the schools are actually running. Specifically, a lot of schools are adding a lot of things that don't belong into schools. A lot of these extra benefits that really don't even belong in schools. And we need some serious reform that needs to happen. That's number one. Number two is what ends up happening is we can actually treat schools far closer to the way they to as a essentially where companies could essentially uh, pick up the tab and essentially pick up the most valuable students essentially by their quality of their work, and they could essentially pick up the tab of what they're doing with it and essentially have it work as an actual benefit. Now, essentially work as an actual draft. Uh, the way that sports draft people, we can actually use that as an actual benefit and have companies draft people going in with it, have some type of testing system where they end up drafting and they can trade people and make aware of where these people currently live with it, especially if it's distance learning, and make it available all their with all their situation with it. And then what they would do is they would essentially pick up the thing, and you would essentially be picking up the cost. Now, obviously, because you're still using a third party, it would essentially it wouldn't necessarily be a third party payer because essentially it's being paid as a benefit, and what eventually it would be is you would eventually drive down the cost of education because they're only going to pay so much. And what is going to happen is they're going to request that they are getting their quality onto what they're investing into. And what's going to happen is they're not going to pay for any of these extra things. On any of these things, like these cry rooms where people can do that with it, or these like pools and all these other extra things. They're basically going to request that schools become more bare bones, and it's going to reduce the actual cost of schooling. And specifically, they might even request that schools get closer to more online schooling for that, and so it reduces the overhead because they're only going to pay so much because you have them footing the bill, and this is considered as an investment. they're going to want to make sure that their investment is fully secure. They're not just going to be dumping money. And they want to make sure that their investment is fully secured and they're not just going to be pumping money into the whole thing. And that would be how it would be the best idea for going forward on that. Obviously, you could do that with it, and then obviously, as people start to pull out with it, you're going to have basically an example of other countries with it. Obviously, when we look at the Philippines, we can see when it comes down to private high schools, they have sponsors. This is essentially what that idea works as, and we can see that their cost is very low. Uh, and then when it comes down to colleges, their colleges are far cheaper when it comes down to it, and they're not dealing with these astronomical costs. Now the reason why we have is because we basically have guaranteed loans, and this basically tells the whole marketplace that they can keep charging more and well above inflation year after year. And this is was established once we established the Department of Education. Um, Let me see this next one. Government should not be responsible for providing health care. And that's right with it because it's not the government's objective to provide health care. Health care is basically that's a commodity. And the fact is I know there's a lot of people who are going to be complaining about that, but frankly, healthcare is a commodity. And if you go before the government got involved, healthcare was far cheaper. The moment the government got involved, the actual cost became astronomical because they would never actually look over the actual costs. And when they got involved, they would just throw money at the situation. The government's solution is always throw money at the situation. Here's the thing: let people control their own retirement, privatize Social Security. Now we could do this with it. I think the best idea that has been brought forth is to sell off a lot of useless government buildings as we start to make government more constitutional, and to actually start to link those things in with certain things like precious metals, and that would essentially make Social Security for the older people that are still have they're still vested in, and we can get them in the system like that to where we can start dumping a lot of these buildings that are just flat out not needed, and we could start to basically get rid of a lot of these departments that are not needed as well. And what this will do, this will severely reduce number one, cost, and number two, we can start selling off a lot of these highly expensive buildings. And this will essentially across and highly expensive land across the whole United States. And what we could do is we could then pay the money for the Social Security that's needed for the people, and slowly move on to a private system to let people put their money where they want it. Um, Replace government welfare with private charity. Well, frankly, all they have to do is basically just get out of the way. And frankly, with it, we've seen that they can do a far better system with it. We've seen in other countries that they can do far better, and that government welfare just basically makes you slave to the system. And just by doing all of this, it would basically naturally cut spending and taxes by over 50%. And I think when it comes down to tax time, nobody likes spending that kind of money, and they don't want to see all this garbage. When we see calculating my results, continue without saving, you can see what it called is I end up scoring as a libertarian, basically the complete opposite, essentially right where uh, the full intention of our founders was meant to be. Our founders were actually libertarian. They actually believed in both personal liberty and economic liberty for everyone. Right now, with it is we've started we kept moving down the diamond, and now we're basically sitting in what type of authoritarian ideas do we want. I mean, at best with it, we might be able to get to some level of moderate if we're lucky with it. That would be the closest we could ever get in the modern era. And I'm taking the test for libertarians, and this should give you an idea. Libertarians believe, like you believe, you should have the right to pursue your own goals as long as you don't harm others. As you may have heard, the core tenet of libertarianism is the principle of non-harm, which states initiating violence against someone is wrong, referred to as principle of human respect. In other words, libertarians live by something like the golden rule. If you believe you should have you should be able to live free and should not be harmed, then you believe others should live free and not be harmed, as long as they are not harming anyone in the process. And I would agree with that. Now, okay, let's begin to two fundamental areas of social change: persuasion, coercion with it, the whole thing with it. And basically, the only thing is I should have power to use force and to defend myself and my property, and that's it when it comes down to that. Basing your answer, being indicated you think it's wrong for individuals, regardless of their differences, beliefs, to initiate violence against others. Some people think that whatever is wrong for the individual to do, such as threaten and initiate violence, is also wrong for the group. But others think when it comes down to a group of individuals, something changes, making violence okay. For example, a group of people decide to take your property against consent, then it's okay. What is wrong for individuals is also wrong for groups of individuals. And frankly, with it doesn't matter with that. They shouldn't be able to choose all of a sudden take that. Do you believe that initiating violence is still wrong, to even if you delegate violence against someone else, for example, through the system of voting? Let's say if you like to have a community, you'd like to have a community swimming pool. You and some of your neighbors decided to put up the question up to vote. Even nearly half your neighbors vote against the swimming pool. They would be forced to pay for it. In this case, with it, I would say I would say that though it is wrong, it's the only way for communities to make decisions together with it. And that's my opinion on that. Based on your answer, you're indicating that it is wrong to initiate violence against your neighbor, even if you delegate it through a system of voting. Do you believe that democracy gives coercive power over the minority? With it, local elections, voter turnout can be as low as 10%, which means 5% plus one voter to get power over the 94% majority who never even voted. And here's the thing with technically with it, when you start to view that in a direct democracy with it, because I think that's what they're referring to here. And in that theory with it, I think we're talking what do you call it, that in that system with it, is a direct democracy really is not lawful. You have strong and consistent moral principles based on your ancestors. You believe that democracy is morally, as it is extended, allows the initially some violence over others, which you have indicated is wrong. What if democratic voting is totally voluntary, meaning that it required to express consent of everyone involving, and coercive force was totally removed? For example, let's say you move to a community, you totally agree to pay membership dues to enjoy certain benefits. In the agreement, you have the right to leave as long as you held up your contractual obligations. A portion of the dues you pay spent according to the community vote. You consented in the process anyway by signing a contract moving the community. And if in time you don't like the result, it's easier to leave the arrangement. If you're consenting to the system of voting in advance with it, you obviously, here's the thing with it. It is okay because no course is being initiated. The parties are only enforcing the agreement. Basically, in that case, with it, that's why I believe with, because you obviously understand that there's going to be negative implications of it uh, that could come about with it. You've indicated that the coercive power is not to be used to force your obedience. It always depends on your prior consent. According to the system, if coercive power is used to force your obedience and compliance, and it offers no opportunity of prior consent. If initiating violence force your obedience is wrong with it, to force your obedience is wrong, and government action initiating violence to force your obedience and government action is wrong. Do you agree? And the fact is, yeah, government action is wrong in that with abuse. Yeah, and I got I got the whole thing on government on human respect of 100%, and that's just the difference with it when it comes down to it. And what where you find the difference between what you would find as nationalism and where you would find areas of, like, let's say with nationalism or and other which is authoritarian. Now, if we want to look at areas like, let's say for instance, if you want to go to left wing with it, now left wing with it, they would basically state. Now, obviously, not all people in the left wing believe this with it, but if they were truly on the left wing, here's where they would do with this: the government should not censor speech, press, media, or the internet. They would agree on that. That military service should be voluntary. That there should be no laws regarding sex between consenting adults, uh, and the war on drugs, and that they should not target undocumented workers. Though when it comes down to this, is they believe that taxpayers should be responsible for student loan debt. Government should be responsible for health care. Um, they still want to keep Social Security going. They still want welfare, and they're against cutting government and taxes, and that's what you're going to find with them. That's what you find what they would technically call a progressive. Now, in a conservative with it, they would tend to disagree that on the all the personal issues, and agree on all the economic issues. Now, where you tend to find moderates is basically people who end up basically maybe agreeing on these five with it, basically where one's maybe on a possible one. Like, let's say military service should be voluntary, maybe they would agree on that. Maybe they're on the fence there with when it comes on immigration. Maybe they agree on repealing the drug laws. They disagree here, and they disagree there with it. They disagree on the censoring the uh, the speech, press, media, and internet, and they disagree on laws regarding sex between consenting adults. And then on the other ones, they let's say they disagree on the cutting of taxes. They disagree on the student loans. They're unsure on the welfare thing. They agree on the Social Security, and let's say they agree on the health care. Now, what you would get on this is you would essentially get, in that case, a moderate. They're essentially someone who basically is right in the middle. And that's basically what we sit at, and that's something very, very important. Now, there's something when it comes down to the elections we need to understand when it comes down to like the historic elections is we need to understand where these elections sit is we need to see that uh, basically ever since we added Texas in 1848 is really where that ended up sitting. And basically that means essentially when we added Texas, and we've you're talking this is and this is still you're talking what is it we're talking like 3 before Lincoln. And even Lincoln did not add in any type of border when that's where we started to add in. You got to think with Lincoln in his first election, he did not add in a border when we had California at the time. We go his second election. And technically, with it because of secession, he could have actually added in a border away from the seceding states. And you still had Grant with it, with some states that were still not back in the Union. And then when still had a couple states not back in, and when they were fully back in with that was Rutherford B. Hayes. When all the states were returned. And that should show you right there that, and that was still before the progressive era had started with it. Then you had Garfield. Then you had Cleveland. Then you go to Harrison. Cleveland again. McKinley. McKinley again. And then Teddy Roosevelt in 1904. So it was not until Teddy Roosevelt basically being there that we actually had an actual progressive president that actually started to change policy. And then that was where we started to really seriously started to change the policy in how everything was done. And then obviously the 1912 election was the first one we had the 48 states. Though it was not until much later that we actually, obviously, as I've stated, it was not until much later that we established the actual border wall. And it's mainly the argument, as we've seen, is over one major thing. It's only because of the uh, the actual welfare spending, and because they're not, with exceptions of getting them through vicariously with being linked with someone else, they're not eligible for any welfare money in for the first 3 years that they enter the United States. And that's the whole point. And when we start to look at it, we can actually see that since they're not eligible, they're not going to be a person that's going to be a threat to the budget. The, the best that they're going to get is schooling and other things like that. Now, what we could actually do to actually help them get adapted is help them into school, uh, and eliminate regulations that stop them from getting work. When people go, oh, they're a drain on the economy, well, that's because of regulations. This is the whole point. When people go, oh, they're a drain on the economy, well, that's only because of regulations that we've put in, and it's through protectionism. If you eliminate those regulations, they're going to get jobs. And people try to say that, or they get into gangs. Well, the fact is they're in gangs because the fact is there's no other way to get work. You've told them that they can't. You've told them that they can't work when they come in, and all they want to do is get a better life. And through protectionism, they've actually made things worse. If you want to actually go after the source of what's making the quality of life worse, it's government through regulations. And through them basically inflating the currency, and through creating countless regulations, through them creating the minimum wage, which makes people unable to be hired. This is what's making things worse. It's not these people who want to come into this country and make a better life. The market will choose who's actually the best worker. And if you're being beat out by someone who basically cannot speak the language, who's basically coming here with a minimal amount of skills, then something's wrong with you. It's not something wrong with them. It's something's wrong with you. It means you don't have a proper amount of skills. You shouldn't be beat out by someone who has a minimal amount of skills entering the country. And if it's someone that's actually highly skilled entering the country, then frankly with it means we don't need it means that there's basically an oversupply of people in your area and area of expertise, and that basically you were charging far too much for your services. And the market adjusted for it, and they went with the one who was basically better at their job and provided the better services, and that they were going to do their do their job at a better quality than you were. And that's the reason why you lost your job to someone else. And people tend to complain a lot about outsourcing as well. Well, the fact is, this is another area that we need to talk about. And outsourcing is merely basically what happens when you have poor monetary policy within your country. And we can actually blame this due to this 1912 election. When Woodrow Wilson won, he established the Federal Reserve Bank. Uh, Basically, what ended up happening is when you centralize a bank for a country, and they're basically keep inflating your currency, you're eventually going, and then you don't allow for any adjustments, and your sole purpose of your bank is to basically raise asset prices. What ends up happening is you're basically going to inflate your currency and you inflate your wages to where your investments in your country are no longer profitable during an election, during your business cycle, when it goes into on the downside. And which means basically that companies are going to be looking for uh, investment bonuses during this cycle, something in which they can invest in which would be profitable for them, which would be low risk, high reward. These are areas in which have less regulations, lower costs uh, on your uh, for your employees. Some things like lower taxation, like maybe in certain areas with it, maybe in certain areas they might not even have taxation, and also availability to establish something very, very quick. And what ends up happening, and then obviously lower employee wages. And what ends up happening is not that they're stealing your jobs, it's just they're setting up new places here in which are more profitable for it. So we can actually, in this country, make something that's more financially viable for uh, the actual nation. That's why they're outsourcing, because they're saying these jobs are not financially viable within this country, and it's given to people who are far better at the job than what we have here, because what we have here are people who can't do the job and who charge far more for the job. And frankly, with it, in many cases, we should be, if we want the thing with it, in many cases, we've tried to bring people over there from the outsourced countries to actually train the people here in the United States to do their job right. And frankly, when we're talking about it, if America was so great, we would not be doing this. We And if we would actually change our immigration law to actually being something constitutional, we would be firing all these people in the United States and actually allow them to bring them right here in the United States to actually do the work domestically, and say we don't need all of these people here. And frankly, with it, they've actually made it very difficult for people to actually get training to be done, and our immigration system to get training to be done, and all these other factors, just because they're trying to block it, because they think, oh well, you can, what it calls, oh well, they might come here and stay. Well, if they're going to come here and stay, they're going to be far more productive. if they get married while they're during their stay. Frankly, if that happens with it, they're going to be far more productive because these people are actually working and they're working their butts off. And the countries they're working at, they're working far harder than our American workers. American workers, the problem being why companies are having issues is the production level is far below the actual salary level, meaning that our workers are earning far more than what they're actually producing. And this has been a massive problem why a lot of companies are actually leaving the United States. And this is something which is very troubling. And we need to start realizing that. We need to start realizing that we need to have harder workers in this country. I mean, there was a time in which American workers were worried about actually producing goods at a higher rate. Now we're just basically worried about, oh, we want all of these benefits and all of this money on our wages with it. Now we're not even we're worried about all this other garbage, and we're not actually worried about what we're actually producing. I mean, there is no more pride in our actual work anymore. So when we get these other countries that are actually having pride in their work and are actually putting out a good product and producing it at a very high rate, well, there's a reason why we're actually falling behind. And then we have our central banks that are actually inflating our currency, making us basically non-competitive on an international scale. What do you think is going to happen? Even Japan, who was actually copying, who's basically was the one who started this, uh, basically asset inflation with the quantitative easing that we've continued through. Even with them with it, they produce things at such a high rate that it still makes it available to where they can actually produce goods at competitive prices without many issues because they're getting a lot of stuff coming in from China for component parts without many issues. And China is still doing it with linking it with more sound monetary policy, despite what you might want to hear from a lot of despite what the nationalists say. China's not deflating their currency, it's everyone else is inflating their currency. It's when we inflate our currency with it and no one else is moving, when we're basically printing so fast, and we can actually show that. You can actually see that the actual rate of the money creation right now, that's money supply, that's M2, money supply, and that's in 2000. Basically, we're talking, it's roughly at about 4 times the money supply that we had in 2000. Now, this is really, really troubling. We're probably going to finish out the year at between 28 to 29 trillion dollars, depending on what we're doing. And this is very, very troubling because if you go over and you look at 2016, you can see we at this time we were about 20 trillion. If you go over to 2020, and he's already added, Trump alone has added $7 trillion in just 4 years. I mean, you're talking, this is just completely irresponsible. I mean, you're talking, he's going to basically average about $2 trillion a year. I mean, there's no excuse for that. And when you actually look at the growth, the actual true growth, when we actually look at numbers with it, he's going to end up being, if you go actually previous to the coronavirus, he was actually at about 1.8% when Obama was at 1.9%, and when Obama even had the situation with both Ebola and which is in Africa, which took out some of our resources. And when you look at the also the situation of the uh, H1N1 flu, which was a global pandemic, and we also had multiple military conflicts under Obama that were added, and you're talking, and obviously Trump did not wind them down really, and we see that that's been a massive problem. And when we start to see that basically that of what's happened now, if we look at the like, let's say for instance, we're going to look at the workforce. We're basically since 2000, if Trump is trying to state that he's trying to say about how great he's grown the workforce, well, we're actually down over 8 million workers from 2000. This is not, and 2000 the was actually after that point. Um, if we look at who's not in the labor force, it's actually gone up 19 million people since the actual amount. Median income is less than $4,000 up. With it, it's actually about $3,500 up from 2000. Now, if you look at inflation, you can actually see that that's actually not a good thing. You can say but the trade deficit is going down with it, but that's because we're not actually bringing any products in. That's the whole thing. We're not buying anything. We don't have any. Our whole thing is we don't have any money as a country. And this is what's actually happened under the whole situation is nationalism really just destroys an actual country. And if you need any other legitimacy to actually prove this, since when have you ever heard of the United States having shortages of toilet paper? If you need any other validation, when you ever seen the United States have any shortages of toilet paper? If the United States is if the United States is supposed to be great, the United States should never have shortages of toilet paper. You never had any other nations out there that were dealing with this that didn't have it before. Other countries they were having shortages of toilet paper were like Venezuela, and Venezuela was dealing with it before. And basically Venezuela is another thing with it that basically has been dealing with nationalism since the mid 70s. And that's what nationalism does to you. It basically destroys a nation. And if you want this is why when we look at it, nationalism not only is it anti-American, it's authoritarian, and just when it comes down to the wealth of a nation, it destroys it. It just obliterates it. I mean, you look at what ended up basically extending the Great Depression of what happened the in 1929. Basically, what ended up extending it past through the 30s with it, and continued it through extensively long, was the actions of FDR. FDR made it extensively through with it, and even in many cases, people felt it even went into the 40s, and that's due to his nationalist policies. He basically made the thing last so long that it could have been over very in a very short manner. but because of his nationalist policies, he actually ran it for far longer. I think it's more the reason why he won it was only because of people's fear of changing presidents during an actual uh, wartime era. And this is the only reason why that actually occurred. And when we start to look at it, is we end up seeing that basically that these types of authoritarian systems with it are as horrible. And if we start to look at when we see people saying that, oh, we need a strong leader, frankly, with it, when we see the Senate and the House of Representatives, when we see the judicial branch that are so the judicial branch, the legislative branch that are so weak, the last thing we need is a strong executive. We need a weak executive that'll actually be even with these things. This is the whole point. And we need something that's going to be very, very weak to actually maximize it. And obviously, beyond this going to a massive economic crisis, we need something that's going to be on top of this that's going to take care of it. Because obviously, when it comes down to it, we're just wasting money when it comes down to the budget. So it's nothing's going to happen there. Nothing's going to happen when it comes down to monetary policy. We know nothing's going to happen there until someone actually goes after and actually wants to do something about that, because people didn't want to do anything about that during the Trump administration beyond a couple of people. Everybody was ignoring it, and everybody just wanted to continue the same policies. They just wanted it in their area. And now under this, whether you're going to find the same policies here, and you're just going to see it continued right through. And it's just things are just going to get far worse until we actually admit that this is the wrong way to go. And the fact is my hope is that basically is that all Biden's going to do is just undo what Trump did as an executive, and basically cause a stalemate when it comes down to the legislative branch. And that's the best thing he could possibly do. And then maybe we'll actually have an actual reset. Maybe the Republican Party will look actually at being a maybe a libertarian right group within maybe what it calls they would have called the left will basically go toward a libertarian left group with it, and maybe they'll actually learn. Because frankly, with it, when it comes down to it, is that they just don't understand the way things work. Because the fact is when you start to push these authoritarian policies, it just doesn't work. Because right now, with it, essentially what they elected was kind of like on the verge of basically moderate to authoritarian. With it was essentially was what Biden is with it, but he's not quite as heavy as Trump. Trump is just flat out authoritarian, because he doesn't even believe in actually working with working through the actual constitutional limits. He just believes flat out you can actually. His whole thing is he felt that he had advisors. They were telling him, such as Stephen Miller, they were telling him that that the Congress was lending him their power on things such as immigration. Well, frankly, I don't think when it comes down to the House of Representatives with Nancy Pelosi, I highly doubt that she was actually doing such a thing. And that's why when we start to look at things on nationalism with it, you find that these people don't even believe in the actual Constitution. They believe basically that they will act as an authoritarian and they will actually take over everything. They believe that they can control your lives, and they don't believe in ideas of individuals. They don't believe individuals have any rights. And they just want to basically trample over them, and that's the whole point. And their whole ideas with it is they will even trample over ideas of trample over enemies and their people, and they'll use this us versus them, and that's the whole idea of nationalism. And I'll basically end it right here with it because I think I go on over all the points. That's about it, and see you guys later. Bye, everyone.